Good Monday afternoon, everybody. I'm Zanilo Evangelista, and welcome to the Hurricane Hub discussion for today, Monday, May 15th, 2023. And starting off by taking a look at the title card, a few changes if you notice. First big thing that I put on the hurricane tracking has begun because it is May 15th and the Eastern Pacific does start today. And because of that, the second thing, no longer off season, huh? No longer off-season edition on the title card. Now we're just calling the Hurricane Hub straightforward because we're basically into the season now. And now today is actually the official start of already one season. So there's really no necessity for including off-season anymore since we're already getting started. And hence we could take a look at the National Hurricane Center with this. They already started with tropical weather bulletins too for the Atlantic. Recent addition as of last several years to start tropical weather bulletins at the same time with the Eastern Pacific. Although the hurricane season in the Atlantic still does start June 1st, though they're doing it earlier, especially with activity that we've seen over the last several years. If you remember, we've had a lot of May storms recently, so it makes sense that they did this change. I think this has been around since about 2021 or so, but still we have it. And of course, no new tropical cyclone activity expected within the next 48 hours and 7 days. Also, a new addition, if you remember, too. They're starting to do 7 day outlooks instead of five to kind of up the outlook, I guess, time to, include more time, I guess, in an outlook. I don't know, but they're making some changes, and one of them is, of course, upping the tropical weather bulletins to 7 days. And we take a look at the Eastern Pacific. Nothing expected there too, and of course, nothing within the next 48 hours there. And why not take a look at the Central Pacific? That really has not been updated though since November 30th because their season, along with the Atlantic, also starts June 1st. So, with that being said, let's go to the satellite view. Of course, still not very much hurricane season yet, though. As again, one thing, obviously, hurricane season for the Atlantic starts June 1st, but also conditions even then are still not that favorable as it would be during the peak. We still have a lot of high upper level winds, wind shear, which is a very unfavorable factor, especially when it comes to hurricanes, because hurricanes really depend on low wind shear, low winds, low wind changes between the atmospheric levels to allow storms to stack up vertically, so storms could develop and be healthy. And that's what we do not have in the Atlantic right now, especially as well with dry air, which is indicative, which you can see with all these low-level clouds. Saharan air, mid-level dry air, very key, kind of factors that we look at in the early season because that's when they're most prevalent, and that's also why the Atlantic usually isn't as active in the early season. But we could take a look at the Eastern Pacific. Them also, dealing with the same as well. It's May 15th, the very start of the hurricane season. Of course, conditions will gradually get better over the next few weeks as we get closer and closer towards the height of activity in the Eastern Pacific. But for now, similar situations: strong wind shear, strong upper level winds, and drier air. But very interesting though, this big, burst of convection near South America. Very vigorous. Not that it's going to become anything. Probably just associated with the ITCZ, Intertropical Convergence Zone, if you don't know what that means. But really, no need to really go into it right now. Just something interesting that I saw pop up just now. But of course, since there's nothing going on in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific, why not let's see what's going on across the whole globe. And one thing I like to look at is the University of Wisconsin website, and trust me, this website is really, really good. I really like looking at it. Not only do they have resources for global tracking, but they also have really good some of these analysis maps on wind shear and vorticity in the Atlantic, and we'll actually look at those in just a second. But first, let's see what's going on across the globe. Obviously, there's always activity going on somewhere. It's not just the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific that sees activity. There's also the Westpac and the Indian Ocean, which we did have a storm several days ago in the northern Indian Ocean. Went on and made landfall in Myanmar, if you remember that. Now we have another storm in the Indian Ocean, this time in the southwest Indian Ocean, and that is Cyclone Fabian. So why not see what's going on with this? Expected to become another strong storm expected to peak at 40 at a Cat 4 strength system. This is, by the way, the data that they're using from the Joint Typhoon Warning Center. Expected 115 knots, so strong storm expected there, and also I believe this is a late season as well, so very interesting indeed, though conditions are favorable right now for that, which is why, of course, it is happening. Though, moving on to, as I said, we'll talk about wind shear a little bit in the Atlantic. Very high wind shear, especially across the deep tropics. Interesting, we have actually some lower wind shear values in the Gulf of Mexico. And we'll start to see a lot more of these greens, especially in the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific over the next few weeks, as, of course, we start to transition from the winter-spring pattern that we have right now to the more summertime pattern, which we have less wind shear. The jet stream kind of lifts north, and we stop seeing influence from a lot of this extratropical activity, which does impart a lot of dry air and wind shear in the Atlantic, which, by the way, if you remember, was the one big issue that we had last year. A lot of dry air and wind shear from extratropical influence, and that tends to happen during the winter because that's just generally how the atmosphere works during the winter in the northern hemisphere. But as that, of course, we move later on in the year, the jet stream lifts north, and we start seeing wind shear die down across the Atlantic. And of course, with that, we'll start to see a lot more of these greens as we see in the Gulf of Mexico, and even this small pocket in the subtropics. We'll probably start to see a lot more of that in the MDR, though a little bit less in the Caribbean, since we are expecting El Nino after all. We'll actually talk about that a little later. But of course, still expecting to see that nonetheless. The Eastern Pacific, though, is still the same. A lot of wind shear across the Eastern Pacific and the Central Pacific as well. Look at this, 100 knots of wind shear in the Central Pacific. Boy, any storm that would try to get there is really gonna get their hats blown off. Basically, that's what it is with this wind shear. Strong upper level winds cutting across the top. Not really favorable for tropical cyclone development, of course, right now. Though, of course, as I said, it's May 15th, so things are going to change. Then we also have the 850 millibar relative vorticity, another thing that I like to look at as well. Deep tropics, you notice there's not a lot of it, although there's actually something, I believe, with some sort of wave or some sort of monsoon or low coming off Africa right now. Of course, we'll see a lot more of that as we get on in progress with the season. But also, you still notice some and quite a bit of extratropical energy in the mid latitudes, of course, associated with troughs with the jet stream. That's still a factor that we're looking at right now. But of course, as I did say before, as we move on in the season, we'll start to see a lot of this energy transfer south, and a lot more energy in the deep tropics from tropical waves, and also monsoon spin-ups, intertropical convergence zone spin-ups that we'll see sometimes throughout the season that we get, or even monsoonal lows like Central American gyres, which we'll actually probably start seeing those in just a few weeks, since those tend to be early season and late season type of situations for the Atlantic. But bottom line, activity will begin to transfer south, and we'll start to see more energy in the tropics in accordance with hurricane season. In the Eastern Pacific, in the meanwhile, though, still also seeing lack of energy in the deep tropics as well. Still a lot of extratropical energy. Right now, it will take time to transfer to the deep tropics, but I do assure you it will happen within the next few weeks for sure. And with that, we could still see, with that though, we could still see, of course, development in both the Atlantic and the Eastern Pacific. This is actually a map that I kind of like to look at. This is climatology map, and we'll probably bring this up a lot more throughout the season, not only for the Eastern Pacific but for the Atlantic as well. A very interesting map that I like to pull up from time to time. And this is also really important because this does show climatology in what usually occurs not just within 1 month, but down to the week and down to the specific time period as well. That's when we could really see when development is expected to occur. And of course, because conditions are not that favorable right now, it still takes several weeks again to start seeing an increase in development. We see a few points of development in the Eastern Pacific, though not much right now since it's only May 15th. And then there's also stuff in the Atlantic as well. which is not surprised, especially given the last few years. Although I actually will say this map is updated 2015. But anyways, that you still get the idea. We've had activity in the Atlantic develop in May, but in the Eastern Pacific, and it really is as we get later in the month in May in the Eastern Pacific. Notice suddenly we go from just a few small dots that we have right near the equatorial Pacific to a whole bunch of these dots all over the Eastern Pacific, and we start to see activity rapidly increase. And of course there's still activity as well in the Atlantic, and this is actually another way to look at it. We can extend it not just from a few weeks in May, we could extend it out through the whole season. Notice how we start to see a rapid increase in development, especially towards the latter half of May, hence given, of course, the start of the season being May 15th. But still, activity does pick up rapidly, and we'll probably will in the next 2 weeks. So any conditions that we have right now with dry air and wind shear, would expect that to kind of die down over the next few weeks, in accordance to the season beginning to pick up, and then from there it gradually upticks generally till July and August and September too, and then after that it kind of takes a gradual decrease all the way up until November, when activity then begins to drop significantly, of course, in both the Eastern Pacific and the Atlantic. But you do notice, though, a big difference between Eastern Pacific and Atlantic activity. Notice one thing is that, and I guess this is why we kind of start June 1st instead of May 15th in the Atlantic. Notice how it does actually take quite a bit of time for activity to really spark up in the Atlantic. We kind of start off June 1st, we have some activity, but it's not really till mid to late August when we have this really stark increase in development, and then of course that builds up to the peak in early September, and usually most of September it lasts as well, and then from there we see a more gradual decline to a total shutdown basically of activity by the time we get to November and December, when activity then becomes when we more or less start to see activity die down in accordance with the seasons changing. But generally this is something that I want to actually point out right now, that it's usually always, as by the time we get to late July and early August, a lot of people, especially when it comes to Atlantic tracking, or at least what I've seen in the last few years, is a lot of people around that time frame, if it's not really active yet, if we're not seeing, like, for instance, tropical systems develop every few days or so in the Atlantic yet, people tend to then, I guess it's kind of a reaction, especially almost in a way because of a very infamous season we've had, 2013. I think especially since then, it's really been since I think 2013 or so, if it's not really active by the time we get to July, late July or early August, a lot of people tend to start doubting the season, and kind of questioning whether or not it'll be active. But keep in mind, and I really want to remind a lot of people that are watching, keep in mind, look at where late July and early August are. We're still in the gradual increase of activity from the start of the hurricane season, and it's really not till mid-August where you start to see this rapid, almost like it shoots up incredibly, very, very, very rapidly. It shoots up to the peak in September. So it's really mid to late August. If we're not seeing an active season yet, or we're not seeing activity yet, or any significant activity yet, don't think it'll stay that way, and remember that it'll probably come eventually. Even if it's not late July or early August, it'll probably be late August, early September, which is when usually the peak occurs, and that's when we'll really start paying attention to activity, especially in the Atlantic, a lot more. But I also want to notice, kind of a little bit of a correlation. A lot of Eastern Pacific activity early on, and usually after that, when the East Pacific begins to level out, notice how we start to see a rapid increase in the Atlantic. It's the kind of correlation, right? Something very interesting to keep in mind, and probably something we'll also watch throughout the season as well. But really interesting that I really quickly wanted to point out. This is from, I've been just seeing tweets from Twitter, seeing tweets that people have been sending on chats here and there, and I noticed this Yakov Kantor, if you, or I think that's how I pronounce his name, probably butchered it. My apologies if I did, but um, you've seen him before. Yakov has pointed out, at least on the most recent models. Let me scroll up. I pointed it out. I kind of put it on because this is all part of a thread, and if you want to see the whole thread, you could go to either Danny Morris, because it's between Danny Morris and Yakov, that they have this whole thread about activity as relating to MJO. The Danny Morris did point out that the JMA, and this is in relation to El Nino, La Nina, and ENSO, and how that pertains to what we could be looking at as we go on later in the year. Danny Morris mentioned JMA has been correcting similar to the European. Note the strong rising cell over the Western Pacific and Eastern Maritime continent and sinking near the Eastern Pacific, and a lot more rising air over Africa and the Eastern Atlantic for June indicates gradual ENSO growth, and very importantly, not rapid. And I find this very interesting because if you've been watching me for some time, you know I've been mentioning how what'll really be important for this season is, because we know El Nino is coming, but it really is important, especially for impacts on the Atlantic. How fast does this El Nino come in, and how fast does it get strong? Very important things. And if we're seeing gradual development of the El Nino, that means we'll probably not see as much overwhelming impact in the Atlantic as quickly, and especially given, because he does mention, and I'm going to show you up what he's showing, Danny Morris, he mentions the JMA. This is the JMA showing a lot less rising motion across the overall Pacific, more confined to the Western Pacific. And notice, this is the latest ensemble forecast. This is what he shows of the JMA. This is, by the way, let me go back. This is from the JMA forecast from April, hence why it says second month, because this is from April. And then from May, this is from this month. The JMA is forecasting a noticeable increase in rising motion over the African continent, West Africa, and over the Eastern Atlantic. And he's been mentioning that the Euro, this is more in correlation with the Euro, which has been showing this. And then Yakov, I believe, earlier on in this thread, let me try to find it, but he mentions the CFS somewhere. Let me see. Right here, the CFS has been trending in the same direction as the Euro, shifting the negative velocity potential cell, which means MJO, stronger rising motion in the atmosphere. That's been moving closer towards Southeast Asia, while the positive cell over the West Atlantic in Central America shifts into the Eastern Pacific, which is what he's been saying is more in line with the European, and what Danny Morris has also been saying is more in line with the European as well. And he does also mention, compared to the CFS, that he says it's likely underdoing the rising motion cell in the Eastern Atlantic and West Africa. As of course you saw, I showed the JMA not long ago. They had a much stronger rising cell of the MJO, of course, in the Eastern Atlantic and West Africa, so probably a little bit of disagreements in the model there, but they still show the general idea. And then Yakov also mentions other models don't agree, showing a weaker negative, actually, hold on, that's not the right one. And then he also mentions as well, I think this is it, because I think there was another tweet as well showing another model. I believe this is it. Sorry for that. Yakov also mentioning is also the UK Met as well, is much closer to the European, with dual negative VP cells, which again means more or less means rising motion in the atmosphere. All this under the umbrella of MJO, if you're not already aware yet. Basically, you should be looking at this as MJO. He shows one near the date line and another one near East Atlantic and Africa, and does not have a notable positive velocity potential cell, so sinking motion. He says it's not like the European when it comes to that, but it does show an overall similar pattern. And this is the European, by the way, positive velocity potential in the Eastern Pacific. That's what the European is showing for June. And then this is what the Met Office is showing as well. Similar pattern. And why I find this interesting as well, I just did look at the 850 millibar zonal wind anomalies, and very interestingly enough, they do show an uptick in easterly trades over the Central Pacific and near the date line. And usually when it comes to El Nino, we would expect westerly winds across this whole entire area. This is, by the way, if you're trying to understand what this map is, this is the Eastern Pacific, not the Eastern Pacific, the entirety of the Pacific. And this is right here, roughly here, 180 degrees. This is the date line, and this is, of course, right along the equator. Hence what this is showing here, 5 south to 5 north, so right near the equator. Usually in the development of El Nino, and especially when it comes to the development of a strong El Nino, we would expect a lot more of these reds. These reds is what we're much more looking for, because this represents stronger westerly winds in the more stronger anomalous westerly moving winds, which helps warm up and downwell waters instead of these blues, which represent trades, and that helps upwell the waters and in turn cool them. And this is more of a pattern. This is more what helps La Nina grow. Not saying we're going towards La Nina. We'll probably still see El Nino develop, but this is very interesting, especially when it comes to the development of a strong El Nino or a rapid growing El Nino, like a lot of people were questioning could occur, and a lot of people were especially thinking could have happened earlier on in the year. We were thinking that we could potentially see a more rapid growing El Nino. Well, not sure about that, especially when we have these zonal anomalies getting closer towards June, because this is May 30th, basically knocking on the door of June, and we still have these strong zonal wind anomalies, easterly wind anomalies in the Pacific. Just something very interesting to mention, though, because as I all said, this is always all very important, especially when it comes to El Nino, because I especially do believe, yes, we have a very warm Atlantic. That should also play a factor, and we'll go over the Atlantic sea surface temperature anomalies a little later on in the week. Of course, we just went over that Saturday, so it would really not make sense to do it today. Not a lot of change would have occurred between now and then, but still, the general idea of the Atlantic has been very warm, but it still really would depend on El Nino, on how quickly it comes in, because the less we see a very strong and a very quickly developing El Nino, the less I would say we would have a shock to the atmosphere in the Atlantic, and in turn that would probably allow the Atlantic to have much more of a window for it to be favorable and for us to potentially see an active season, rather than if we see a El Nino come and develop very quickly and in turn leaves the Atlantic kind of left out, because there's a shock in the atmosphere that we see it quickly skewing in one direction instead of it going there gradually. So that's very interesting that I did note, and I'll probably continue to watch this because it really is important, especially with June coming out very soon. Probably will update my predictions then, and we'll also see more predictions come out then as well. But very interesting when it comes to El Nino, because that also not only that affects the Atlantic but the Eastern Pacific as well. That'll have an implication on Eastern Pacific activity, because if we were truly expecting a quick developing strong El Nino, and it would have been already happening by now, we would have probably already seen some Eastern Pacific activity. We'll probably would start to see, and we'll probably see a lot more of an Eastern Pacific activity than Eastern Pacific season, and in turn that would probably suppress the Atlantic a lot more. But with this development of potentially a slower El Nino, it all depends on how this fares. But very interesting with the models. Could we potentially be in for a slower developing El Nino, that'll especially be something very interesting we need to watch over the next 2 weeks. A lot to cover and a lot to be watching with the journey that is just beginning. It's only May 15th once again, and really excited to see and very curious. Excited, of course, in a tracking way. Of course, we're not really doing this, and this is something very important to mention as well when we usually talk about excitement for tracking hurricanes. It's usually not out of wanting to see destruction. It's usually really just pure interest for how all these things work, because really, must I tell you, once you get into the science of how these storms develop, hurricanes, it's really a fascinating thing. And it's just really so sad that we have these storms impact land sometimes in ways that scar places for decades. Hence, one thing, Katrina. But it really is unfortunate that we have that. But at the same time, the way this is just also the fury that these hurricanes have, it just makes it all that more interesting of how these develop. And whether or not we'll see storms that are like that this year, we'll have to see. But of course, as I did mention, it's only May 15th, and the journey is just now beginning, really. But with that being said, of course, that does wrap up today's discussion. The first discussion out of the next, I guess, 200 or so days. Of course, I'm going to do another one tomorrow. And as I did mention, we'll probably do every day, if not almost every day from now, basically till the end of the season. So we'll be switching gears away from those weekly discussions, off-season discussions, to now the Hurricane Hub, which will now be every single day, tracking what goes on and see if anything new comes up every single day. And if not, we'll probably just have a very short video, then probably discussing something along the lines of El Nino or something like that, or something maybe else, something interesting. So in some other topic, of course, related to weather does come up, we'll talk about it then. But that does wrap it up. If you did like what you saw, please like, subscribe, share, as I always say. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you back tomorrow.